Welcome to the Happy Horse Nutrition Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Nerida, and today I'm joined by two wonderful team members from Ciaron Maher Racing. Katrina Anderson, who leads their sports science team, and Josh Kadlec-Cavanagh, their head of data and performance. Together, we're diving into one of the most exciting nutrition transformations I've had the privilege of being a part of in the thoroughbred racing industry. Ciaron Maher Racing has done something few others have been brave enough to do. In an industry that's been feeding horses almost the same way since the 1960s in Australia, they've stepped away from tradition and embraced science-based nutrition. The results? Horses performing at their peak, fewer health issues, and some strong data to back it all up, including winning the Australian Racing Premiership now 2 years running and winning the highest prize money ever by an Australian trainer in the last season. Kat, Josh and I talk about everything from the three major feeding changes they implemented to the performance slump they knew was coming and pushed through, to a brilliant case study involving a horse named St George, whose chronic and would-be career-ending health issues were transformed, at least in part, through targeted nutrition. If you've ever wondered whether feeding less grain could actually improve performance, or how gut health connects to everything from foot soreness to behaviour and tying up, this conversation is hopefully going to open your eyes to a better way to do things. Let's get into it. Kat and Josh, welcome to the Happy Horse Nutrition Podcast. It is awesome to have you with us today.
Thanks, Nerida. Great to be here.
Oh, I'm so looking forward to this conversation because I love working with you guys. But before we jump into it, we might start with you, Kat. Can you just give everyone a bit of a background on your background and how you ended up in racing and then how you ended up in this role with Ciaron Maher Racing?
Yeah, absolutely. So I actually grew up on a farm in New Zealand. Like a lot of country kids, I had a pony myself. My parents had a thoroughbred adjustment property, so racing was just always sort of part of my life from a very young age, and that's where it really began. I was also an athlete, so growing up, running every weekend. As you get older, the training starts to get more serious, and I was always really drawn to the science side of things. I love biology. I always wanted to understand, why a particular training worked or why nutrition mattered. And that sort of led me to studying biology and sports science at university. And then later I went on to complete a research master's at the University of Melbourne, and that was focused on injury prevention in racehorses. So I sort of did a full circle background to horses, and it was really nice to be able to combine sort of like all of my passions together. And I was lucky enough to have met Ciaron Maher along the way, who was also really fascinated. He has always had that brain of understanding the why. He's an exceptional horseman, but he also wanted to understand why each training was implemented or how he could improve. And he looked across at what was being done in human sports and sports science and couldn't really understand why it wasn't part of horse racing. And so we sort of combined well, and that led to a role here at Ciaron Maher Racing, and I've been here for 5 years now, leading the sports science team. The role really started with sort of really basic monitoring training, giving feedback, but then it's grown where we've been able to use research and apply our own data insights to the training side of things. But then it's evolved where, you're looking at every aspect of sports science, research and innovation. And then really the last sort of 2 years, we've, a big focus on nutrition, which has sort of led us here in our partnership with Nerida, and I'm excited to dive into that today.
Awesome. I love finding out about people's backgrounds as I do these podcasts. So there's so much that I don't know about people, but it's always fascinating to know. Like, I didn't know that you grew up on a farm and that you had the adjustment property. Sort of makes sense why you're so comfortable around the racehorses, or every time I've seen you, you're so comfortable around them.
Yeah, and my parents liked that when I mentioned them in any kind of introduction, so because they feel like they had a part to play.
Yeah, thanks, Mum and Dad. And how about you, Josh? How did you end up where you've ended up?
Yeah, I came on board with Ciaron 3 years ago now in a data science capacity. In my background, a little bit different to probably most people in racing. Obviously, I came from statistical background. I did a Bachelor of Science in Statistics at uni. I was fascinated by performance analysis and obviously the huge exponential growth that it was going through probably 20 years ago, with the Moneyball theme obviously being one of the key ones. And now probably 10 years ago, AFL clubs were getting into engaging in hiring a sports science and performance analyst team, probably even further back than that, with the emergence of companies like Champion Data, etc. And I always wanted to get into that field, and I thought it would be through the human performance side of things. And I sort of went through a roundabout way of going through the wagering sector, learning about performance ratings along the way, modeling for horse racing markets to understand how horses are trained to peak on a race day from a form perspective. Very sort of form driven backgrounds there, but always was intrigued about wearable technology, what that was gathering. Could that be a predictor of performance on the racetrack, and how horses are performing from a welfare perspective? And so, yeah, came on board with Ciaron 3 years ago now in a data science capacity. Then the department was headed up by Matt Ricks, who's now gone on shortly after I came on board to go back into the wagering sector himself. And I stepped up to the head of data and performance, and kept developing out the team to, really developing dashboards, expanding on our large database to make sure that we're housing all our data in an accurate manner, which we will talk a little bit about later on in the podcast, as well as then running analysis and predictive modeling around tools that we can sort of feed into the training team to make better decisions at the end of the day. So I got finally around to the performance analyst side, and I guess it wasn't really I never really thought it would be with a horse, but I'm loving the industry, and it's got so much growth in this area that is fascinating, and fascinated by the nutrition side and how it plays a massive role in obviously fueling these amazing athletes.
And it's a huge amount of data, isn't it? When you've got 400 plus horses in training at any one time, like the amount of data that you see is huge.
Yeah, absolutely. We love good sample size, so it's a great stable to be engaged in this type of research and development of collecting the data as well. So it's a great, the size of the stable really does help, and we get such a vast number of different horses, different profile of horses, and we're collecting obviously the training data along with that nutrition data that we can start to draw some correlations about how small changes in feed and supplementation and the amount of feed we're feeding can change performance, not only on the racetrack, but also in training, and looking at recovery and stride lengths if there is any correlation there.
Yeah, I love it. You're right with sample size. So often when we do horse studies, it's 20 horses or maybe sometimes even 4 horses. So having 400 horses moving along in one stable is a pretty cool thing to be involved in. But lucky for you to be there to crunch all the numbers. So, all right, let's move on to talking about the backstory to the changes in feeding and nutrition. So I guess that from my perspective, the Australian thoroughbred industry is quite antiquated in many ways, and certainly in feeding and nutrition. So you guys know this, but I did a survey of 70-something racing stables back in the very early 2000s, and the industry tends to still be feeding that way largely. The fact that Ciaron Maher Racing has kind of stepped away from that is a little bit unusual. What was it that brought about the courage to make that change? There's not a lot of people who are game to step away from the feeding model that's been used here maybe since the 60s.
Yeah, I think Josh would probably have a very similar initial answer to this, and that was that Ciaron wanted to know why. Why are we feeding the way we're feeding? A lot of it didn't really make sense to him either. And like a lot of things in racing, you're sort of bound by tradition a lot of the time. We have these elite athletes, and over the years we've been refining training and trying to improve their performance in all these different ways. But if we're not fueling them right, well, we're always going to sort of hit a ceiling of what they can achieve. But then, working with you, Nerida, and once you start questioning the traditional ways of feeding, you realize a lot of what we do actually doesn't make sense. Your wild horses graze continuously, and then we have our horses in a stable environment where we're giving them sort of intermittent meals of high starch compared to the fiber that they are designed to break down and use as energy. So that's just been the norm for so long, and it's been quite incredible that Ciaron was that one that wanted to challenge that, when as a stable and as a we were performing at an elite level. So sort of does come with a big risk to make such a big change. But I guess working with yourself, Nerida, gave us that confidence to be able to do that. But I don't know if you've got anything else to add there, Josh.
Yeah, I'm pretty similar. I mean, it's always been Ciaron's first question is the why about everything that he does, whether that's the sports science or the nutrition side. And like we said, we engaged Nerida to come and review our procedures and protocols across all locations, which was fascinating. We still see a lot of sort of idiosyncrasies with certain locations across different facets of the business from time to time. And being such a large operation, it's like really critical just to have everything streamlined, all standardized, feeding the same. Because obviously, I think back when Nerida came in to have a look, we were still, horses were traveling between locations and would change feed, which obviously, Nerida, you can talk about a little bit why that plays such a critical role later. But just things as simple as that, keeping it all standardized across all our locations is key. So it's just sort of tightening the screws a little bit, and then like a little bit of a cleanup, I guess we were doing, and then really finding streamlining efficiencies and making sure we feed the right way for what we're trying to fuel these horses for, like Kat says, that is against their natural way of development and evolution, I guess. And I guess, Nerida's, you've given us a lot of reports that I still refer to day to day. They're like the Bible of nutrition, which is great to refer back onto and look at also how things have changed at the stable. So, it's brave of Ciaron to make that decision to sort of break out of the mold. And that was our first project, which was called Breaking the Mold, I guess, back in 2023 at the start of the year. And that's been, the start, and that's where we've ended up today, just to try and break the mold of feeding.
Yeah. So I guess a little bit of background, because we all know the background, but I was at the beginning of 2023 that I first went through all the stables, and gosh, time flies, doesn't it? And my role was, so what Josh and Kat had asked me to do was just go in and just observe what was being done in each of the locations that I went to, and then pick out, what was different, what was the same, what could be changed. And I was really just an observer. It was funny. One of the really lovely stable hands thought I was there watching them for the day. So she's like being extra super diligent with everything that they did. And then I told her at the end, or she asked me at the end of the day, and I said, no, I'm just watching what they're eating. But I was actually a little bit anxious going into the stable initially. I think Warwick Farm was the first one I went into, because I typically in Australian racing, there's a lot of things that, not enough hay being fed is probably the biggest one. And I hate seeing it. I work a lot, as you know, in Japan, and those horses over there just swim in hay. They have so much hay all the time. But I was so relieved when I went through the first stable. The horses were all coming to talk to me, and they were calm, and there was hay, and so it was a nice experience. But yeah, we did pick up quite a few things that were inconsistencies, which we between locations, which we ironed out. But so moving from those initial visits, there was 3 major changes that we made. It was actually the trainer who owned the Mossvale property that Ciaron Maher now has, so Bong Bong Farm. I actually worked for him prior to you being in there, and the vet that called me to ask him to go and work for him, I initially said I don't do this work in Australia, and he begged me, and I said to him over the phone, I said I can tell him the 3 changes he's going to need to make: feed loose and hay before they work the horses in the morning, make sure hay is available all the time, and make sure that the grain they're feeding is digestible, and feed less of it. And that's pretty much without knowing any stable. They would be the first three things that I would want to make sure that we have in place. And they were the three things, I guess, that we focused on initially. We didn't change any diets for quite a while, but just making sure. So some of the stables were already feeding lucerne before work, but it wasn't enough. And there is a whole podcast on feeding lucerne hay before work in the, I think it's like number 4 in the podcast series. But the theory behind, well, not the theory, the reason we do that is because the lucerne hay fills up the stomach, stops acid from splashing around during training, and it also brings a lot of saliva into the stomach to dilute and buffer the acid in there so that the fluid that's in the stomach is not so acidic and won't burn holes in the top part of the stomach while they're training. Hay available all the time. We've all mentioned this already. I mean, these were horses that have evolved for so long on really high forage diets, and their entire gastrointestinal tract is set up to be consuming forage slowly over a 24-hour period. And the more we can keep these elite performance horses eating the way that they have evolved to eat, the better their health will be, the better their mental health will be, and the better their performance will be. I actually recorded a podcast yesterday with Liz Owens, who was the nutritionist. So Ciaron Maher Racing contacted Liz Owens, and Liz said, I can't help you, because she'd just moved back to Western Australia. She said, talk to Nerida. And I just did a podcast interview with her yesterday talking about the FEI Be a Guardian initiative. And where we got to was that feeding horses in a way that is best for their welfare is also the way that you feed them to get the best out of them from a performance perspective. So it's never an either or. And I think that's probably where the Australian racing industry hasn't really caught up on that.
Yeah, it's never one or the other. They work hand in hand. And we see it all the time from a performance perspective, just like the work we're doing with injuries. It's going hand in hand, well-being, performance. You never see one increase without the other decreasing or vice versa.
That's interesting, even in the injury space.
Yeah.
I always think that too, is that obviously academic research is always led by that in terms of injury mitigation and prevention. And I mean, it goes hand, sometimes we get told about, grants and things like that in the academic space, but I mean, we're all for it because we know that safer horse on the racetrack and the healthier horse that's in a lower risk injury state is going to perform better on the racetrack. At the end of the day, we've got plenty of evidence out there that we've started to collate that suggests that as well.
Yeah, and it's such a big it's a really cool mindset shift, but it's a big mindset shift for a lot of people to make. And then the third change we made was less grain, but more digestible grain. And that kind of played right into, I guess, my biggest area of expertise, because it was what my PhD was on. But, feeding grain in a way that you get maximum energy out to fuel the horse while doing minimal damage, especially to the hindgut microbes. I think we've really seen that has made a big impact on the health of the horses, but also hopefully the performance of the horses.
Yeah, I mean, all of the above that you've mentioned have played a big role, and it really was a long process to get to where we are today. From the point of view coming and visiting and sort of aligning and highlighting those small changes that could be made, which we implemented straight away and sort of aligned all of our different locations, and then worked with you to sort of complement the feed and the less grain. But I think along the way, just with the education and being able to pass it on to trainers so they were understanding why we were doing what we were doing and how it sort of made sense, and then that sort of has opened up sort of different areas of gut health and nutrition, just, looking at things like Saltprim. I mean, we used to use Saltprim every time a horse traveled, but we didn't understand the actual damaging effects that it was having on the gut. The use of bute has gone down, the use of Gastropal has gone down, all because we're focusing more on fixing the actual health of the gut rather than just trying to sort of band-aid the effects of having poor gut health, I suppose.
So with the Saltprim, because that was one thing that was picked up on those initial stable visits, and then I did managed to find a research paper that showed that that particular antibiotic in that product does have a long-lasting negative effect on the hindgut microbes and takes them quite a bit to recover. So essentially we're just hammering the poor little microbes every time. And from memory, it was given to horses because you were worried about travel sickness. It was when they were doing the long hauls between Melbourne and Sydney. Is my memory correct?
Yeah, exactly. And I think also even to Adelaide. So just sort of extended trips, they would be given Sulprum. And it was just a normal process that was just given to them. Yeah.
So the interesting question, I guess, would be: have you seen, since you've stopped using Sulprum as a preventative, have you seen an increase in respiratory illness after travel, or
No.
not?
No.
I guess, yeah, it's all the same. So it probably wasn't preventing a whole lot there as a preventative measure, really, at the end of the day. And we're probably, like you say, got a healthier, microbiome at the end of the day for it. So which is hard to obviously quantify, but some of this stuff, it's not quantifiable as much as I like to think it is. But you have to think that all of this goes a long way. And like Kat said, obviously the Gastropel, we were using a whole lot more of it, and we go through phases, but we're trying to reduce the amount of that from time to time. Ulcers are a big part of this industry as a whole as well. And I guess a big database that we've started now to collect of all our gastroscope results of gastric ulcers that have been observed, and we started to put into place a bit of a procedure at the start of the year, which was a process of getting them gastroscoped after their first trial and their second up run, which has a really nice standardized approach. And a lot of those horses after their first trial do end up with severe gastric ulcers, and obviously they're treated using the Gastropel, which is the most accurate method of curing those. And we do see, unfortunately, a lot of those do come back, and it's a way of, I think that's just something that we have to try to mitigate over time, and whether or not it makes a effect on performance, which we've sort of seen in our data set. It does from time to time, but recently we've had some really good results of horses having runs with severe ulcers. So it's probably not as conclusive as we want it to be. But yeah, definitely mitigating the use of Gastropel, like you say, to have that healthier microbiome is something that you don't think about at the forefront, that you've made us sort of aware of when you came on board, Nerida.
Yeah, I mean, the Gastropel, like it's so, well, not necessarily that brand, but the acid blocking drugs that are used to treat ulceration are sometimes also used to prevent ulceration. But when we do that, we're wiping out a really important part of the gastrointestinal tract. So you take that acid out, and all of a sudden you don't have protein digestion being initiated in the stomach. Part of my research showed that you get significantly lower starch digestion in the small intestine, so they're not able to extract the amount of energy out of their feed that they would be if they did have, that acid sitting in their stomach. It's super important for calcium digestion and absorption, particularly when they're getting a lot of their calcium from fortified feeds, because we typically use limestone, which is calcium carbonate, and it needs the acid to break the calcium away from the carbonate so that the calcium can be absorbed. So if we knock the acid out, I mean, it is essential, I agree, when we're treating ulcers, but if we're knocking it out all the time in an effort to prevent them, then we've got all these downstream negative effects that are not necessarily immediately obvious.
Yeah, and we've definitely incorporated that with that understanding of the detrimental side of using Gastropel for long periods of time, where we're giving it as a treatment rather than a prevention or an ongoing sort of, prevention or preventative measure.
So I'll just stick with it. We'll go back to ulcers because I want to talk about them more because they're such a challenge for racehorses. But just with the changes, what's your sense of the amount of grain that horses used to get fed per day versus what you would be feeding now? Because I think that's really interesting. Like we tend to see this mindset in racing that horses need 7 kilos or more of grain a day, and that's just the norm. But you guys are kind of broken out of that.
Yeah, I'll just start by saying that we've probably just found different ways of giving horses energy or digestible energy, from the extruded grain, where it is easier for the horses to digest, and making sure that they are handling the amount of grain that we're giving. And we can touch on that a bit later, but along with the sort of pH measures that we've been using to measure that, but then adding or allowing the horse to have more fiber. So if we're not filling their gut with too much grain, they're able to eat more hay continuous during the day. And then with those horses that do require more, that are already sort of at that limit of grain, we've been able to add oil. But, even with the results we've had, you still slowly see the trainers reverting back to giving them more grain. And then, you're having to sort of challenge them again with that information. And yeah, Josh has done some really cool work looking at the weight to sort of feed ratios. But yeah, really fascinating to see the performance side of things.
Yeah, so just touching on what Kat was mentioning there, we've recently, obviously it was a great just rule of thumb is to give, 1 kilo of feed per body weight, which is something that Nerida showed us along the way, and obviously monitoring that over time and then collecting that data over time. And it was a real eye opener when we looked at horses that weighed under 500 kilos, that were being fed in excess of that ratio. So those horses getting fed, even just 5 to 6 dippers of feed were actually underperforming quite drastically against the expectation. So that's a nice standardized measure that obviously that'd be quite independent of obviously what they're being fed, unless someone in the market knows exactly what they're being fed. So it's a nice metric and a yardstick that we like to measure against, because it creates a nice expectation measure. And interesting to see that, and whether or not we're feeding them the extra feed because they're struggling to hold body weight, whatnot. But there was a large sample in there, so you'd think that obviously we could come to a solid conclusion that those horses that were actually being overfed against that ratio of dippers to body weight, they weren't getting any benefit out of being fed the extra feed, and those horses that were more optimal 1-to-1 ratio were actually performing closer to market expectations. So off the back of that, we could suggest to Ciaron and the rest of the training team to make sure, especially in those lighter weight horses, that feed is optimal, and to switch to if they're needing extra energy or to hold weight, etc., to be looking into sort of other supplementation techniques through oils and whatnot.
Because I think what a lot of trainers don't realise is that the fibre in the hindgut, so the hay and the chaff, and if we use things, so you mentioned, Kat, finding other ways to get energy into them. We've used sort of high energy fibres, a little bit of beet, a little bit of lupin hulls, different times, but all of that fibre gets fermented in the hindgut by the microbes that live in there. I know I'm talking about stuff that you guys know, bear with me. But those fibres get fermented, and then the microbes produce volatile fatty acids, and those VFAs get absorbed from the horse's hindgut into the body, and the muscles use them as a direct source of energy. So I describe a healthy hindgut in a performance horse like a rechargeable but always fully charged battery, because it's just constantly pumping energy out into the horse's muscles that the horse can use whenever it's got oxygen available in the muscles. It can burn that energy, and it can leave all the glycogen in its muscles alone. But when you start to feed those smaller horses those higher proportions of grain, some of that grain, regardless of how digestible it is going to end up in the hindgut, because you just overload their gut's ability to digest it. And when starch goes in the hindgut, it shuts down that fibre fermentation process, and you get less energy coming out of the hindgut. So they're much more reliant on their muscle glycogen, which they'll then burn through so much faster, and they hit fatigue a lot quicker when they're racing. So there's really explainable ways for why more grain actually depresses performance.
And that's so fascinating. I've really enjoyed learning about that, and also being able to educate the trainers and also just the staff. They are the ones that have been able to provide that information for us when we looking at whether horses are, getting that overload in their hindgut, which we see by, or the measurable ability where we can take a pH reading of their poo, and that is basically telling us if it's a lower pH, so more acidic, that where there's more grain basically undigested, and then we can make those changes to the horse's feed. But the staff, I thought it would be the last thing that we would get staff doing, but they all seem to find it really fascinating, interesting, and because they know what that measure is being able to contribute to, and they see the changes in the feed from that measurement that they've taken, and then they get to see the changes in that horse's health and well-being, and often behavioural as well, because they're a lot happier as well.
Yeah, it makes a huge difference. So if let's skip to the wins for the stable. Not literally, you've had lots of wins, but the wins from on a nutrition front. And I think that the fecal pH is definitely, I mean, it's a very measurable thing, so it makes it a really cool metric. But the shift we saw in that, I think it was a definite win. So one of the things that I did when I first went through all of the stables was in the very wee hours of the morning, and initially just with a soil pH test kit. So it was tricky underneath the lights in the stables, and it was still very dark outside. But testing some fecal pHs just to see where they were sitting, and lots of them were coming back at below a pH of 6. And essentially when you get below a pH of 6.2, you know that your good fibre fermenting microbes are in a lot of trouble. They don't like acidic environments, and they'll be shutting down and starting to die. You get down into the 5s and they're really in a world of hurt, and you'll be seeing, I guess, hindguts that are very dominated by the starch fermenting bacteria, and they're not nearly as friendly to the horse. They don't provide the energy that the fibre fermenters provide, and they actually produce compounds that break down things like vitamin B1, and then vitamin B1 is essential for muscle energy generation. So if you've got a hindgut full of starch fermenting bacteria that are then breaking down vitamin B1, you've got a horse that literally has got a roadblock in its muscles because it doesn't have the B1 to generate the energy it needs to gallop. So yeah, it was. I don't know if you've got the data there in front of you, Josh, of the pH shifts that we saw from the very original diets right through to now.
Yeah. I guess we did start to collect them after you came on board and suggested it's just as simple as a soil kit to test them, and we got a few of our great staff out there to test across our several occasions. And when we did make that change, there was a more stable level of pH that was raised into that safer level, like you say. And we saw, I mean, the amount of times we'd seen prior to the changes that we'd seen the pH levels, below 6.2, like you say, in a bit of a low pH range that was worrying for their hindgut, was a bit alarming. And obviously, you gave us the instructions on what to do there in terms of adding more easily digestible, supplementation and feeds into that diet. And then obviously, when we did make that major change with our feed, that average level came up to sort of 6.4, and you couldn't believe how often you'd be seeing even 6.5 and 6.6, which is a much healthier hindgut at the end of the day, isn't it?
Yeah, at that level, I mean, you don't want it to go too high, because then that sort of says that, well, there's not many volatile fatty acids, so there's not so much energy in there. So it's a really fine balance. But yeah, up at that 6.5 to 6.7, it's a beautiful range, because you know that the gut wall is going to be healthy and the microbes in there are going to be healthy. We actually did some microbiome testing with Dr. Belinda Chapman and her PhD student Georgia. That was fascinating, because you could see the shift in microbes. And I said to Belinda, this is the closest thing to horses speaking to me that I've ever had. But it was cool because we could see the shift from the higher levels of, very roughly off the top of my head, it was like 3% lactic acid producing bacteria on the original diet versus back down to 1%, which is the level that we would expect to see them when we shifted over onto the lower grain and more digestible grain diet.
Yeah, I think from our perspective, that was really rewarding to see proof that what we were doing was making a difference, and you could actually visually see the shift of the bacteria, and they were shifting more closely towards what you would see in the microbiome of a wild foraging horse, which is what you'd want to see. So there was a lot more fiber digesting bacteria. I think that was correct?
Yeah, no, for sure. Yep. And there was those couple of horses, I can't remember their names, and we won't name them, but there was a couple of horses that their microbiome was so wildly different from what it should be. And when you went back, I remember, Josh, you went back and looked at them, and they were performing well below expectation.
Interestingly, we talked, a lot of the tests had been, I think they were all done up in Sydney, and this cohort of mares actually that all had this vastly different profile of microbiome, and I think they had some different fungi in their gut, which they hadn't seen, which Belinda and Georgia hadn't seen before in any of the profiles. And interestingly, they were all performing well below expectation. And interestingly as well, Joe up in Sydney said that they were all they're all very poor behaviour, quite wild temperament in these horses, hard to handle, which was quite interesting, and quite several parts of their training was, very variable and hard to sort of get a grip on. So it was something interesting. Obviously, we always like to be able to action what we're seeing there. And unfortunately, a lot of those horses had been, moved on to other stables and gone to the breeding barn since. But it was very interesting insight to see that, and something that definitely could be used a little bit moving forward. And maybe, I don't know if Kat wants to talk on it now a little bit about what we unravelled with St. George's, because that's been a big part in terms of changing his feed and getting him back to the races.
Yeah, absolutely. That's sort of probably one of the most significant wins, as you would say, Nerida, for us. So St. George, he's an international horse, had ongoing feet issues, but like he basically had a type of thrush in his feet, very, very bad. Everything we tried, obviously from a management point of view, farrier, using different ointments, and, just like everything that you would try with a horse with those sort of issues. We were able to manage him for some time, and we did have him racing, but, they got too bad, and sort of got to the point where it was almost concluded that he would be retired from racing. And we thought, why don't we get a microbiome test on him? So we sent that, and Belinda was able to do that for us. And then Nerida, you actually formulated a feed for him based off what you found in the microbiome. You can probably touch on what you found. I think there was some interesting bacteria that you said that just shouldn't be in there. It wasn't an easy formulation to follow. There were a lot of sort of little bits and pieces to put together, but it's amazing to see the team here like get behind it, and every day he had his own. It was like a chef out there putting his feed together. And yeah, the change, I mean, it wasn't immediate, but he's progressively got better and better. He also had these what do you call them, sort of fungal wounds on his pastern and Nera's eye, which were also quite they were quite angry. They weren't and also things that we didn't really know how to treat or improve. And this diet change has been significant in his improvement. He is a different horse. His feet have cleared up. His wounds have cleared up. He's in full training. He's actually going back racing this weekend. So that's good timing. But, and I am 100% sure that without improving, him from the inside, we wouldn't have got to the results we have. I know we've made other changes. He's training out at Fingal, our farrier. John Bunting's been doing a lot of work with him. But like gut health, really, that was the crucial part here, I think.
Yeah, his feet really were bad. I remember the first photos I saw of him. I was like, oh man, how are we going to fix this? But and we're never going to know what made the difference, and likely it is a combination of everything that we've done. But yeah, his hindgut microbiome was really interesting, and I probably should leave you thinking that Belinda and I had this really detailed look at his microbiome and knew exactly what we were looking at. But the reality was, I was on ChatGPT going, "What's this microbe? What's that microbe? what's this microbe? But there was, the conclusion I came to was his microbiome actually looked like a feedlot cow. So he looked like a horse that had been adapted to a high grain diet over a long period of time. So he had lots of he had lots of lactic acid utilizing bacteria, which would tell me that, for a long time he's been fermenting grain in there, and then that population of bacteria have actually built up to utilize the lactic acid and turn it back into volatile fatty acids. His diet changes were really around, let's get fiber diversity back into his diet. Let's completely take the pressure off his hindgut by taking, I think we essentially took all the grain out of his diet at one point. And we had as many different types of fibers as we could get in there. Definitely not a diet that you would try to roll out across the stable. You'd have mass exodus of your feed room, your feed room staff. But yeah, I mean, it's amazing. Like seeing his feet now, they just look like normal, healthy hooves, which is unbelievable.
Yeah, I saw him in the types yesterday. He was pawing the ground, and the guy that was saddling him said, yeah, he wasn't doing this about 6 months ago with his sore feet, so he's sort of showing off how good he feels.
Yeah.
And the main issue that we've got at the moment is Ciaron and Jack keep telling us that he's holding too much condition, and I'm like, well, we're not feeding him that much grain. We can't really do much less. He's just so healthy.
And that in itself is such a cool thing, like he was until 3 weeks ago, Kat, he was only on 1.5 kilos or something of grain a day. He was getting fibers and oils and things, but very, very little feed, and holding his weight in full race training pretty much on a diet of hay and fiber.
Yeah, exactly. It's quite amazing.
It just shows you the power of a healthy hindgut. Like, it's just unbelievable. We've got him on more grain now because of my experience is that you can't race thoroughbreds on very low grain diets. They don't perform so well. But he's a cool story. So while we're talking about horses with sore feet, also when I first came through the stables, there was a lot of horses on a special diet, and they were classified as the footy horses. And I actually haven't asked you this, Josh, but what's our incidence of that now?
I think the Kat and I were discussing this before. I think the term is like the footy term is just gone out the window, whether or not we're managing through it. It is through the nutrition or not, but I think it has to be. It has played a massive part in it. Kat, would you probably say the same there?
Yeah, absolutely. That was an issue we were sort of dealing with, and like you say, they were on. We used to feed them high-gain ice, so it was just like a low, like just a pellet really, and that was how we were managing them, sort of with the same idea, I suppose, that they weren't getting too much starch, but now we're not actually having those issues to deal with from the start. So we're, but yeah, I can't remember the last horse that we had that was termed footy here. So that's a big win. Definitely had less tie-up horses as well. That would be another win, I would say. Also just sort of health issues around arrhythmias and sort of conditions like that can be quite common in a racing stable. Our prevalence of arrhythmias has definitely decreased since we changed the diet.
And I think the cool thing is too that there's not supplements, or like not any big degree of supplements in here. Like racing diets can get so expensive when you start adding this supplement that's $3 a day and that supplement that's a couple of dollars a day. But when you're feeding a really good foundational diet, you tend not to need a lot of those extra bits and pieces.
Yeah, exactly. So because we've reducing the these sort of factors that were sort of part of our stable prior, without even thinking about it, you're not sort of looking to the shelf to look for a supplement to fix an issue because the issue is no longer there. And then that obviously is great for our owners. Having a horse in training is expensive enough without all the add-ons of supplements and, things that say that they do this and that, when our base feed now is doing that for our horses from a health perspective. So it's not only good for our horses, but it's also good for our owners.
And speaking of the owners, because they're such a big part of this, and these horses are a significant investment at times, well, most of the time really, because they're nearly all expensive. But has there been any change, Josh, in the like the recovery period and the interval between races? Like, are they racing more often? Because this is another question I haven't actually asked you for a long time.
Yeah, it's hard to assess really whether or not that's just Ciaron trying to try different things, and obviously we're trying to evolve with our training methods all the time. But I would definitely say, as a more rounded approach, we're probably having slightly longer preps from time to time, and the horse is staying healthy for that time. So it's more of that anecdotal evidence where the horses, they're staying well, they're holding their condition well across the course of a preparation. I would say a lot more than previously. But there's always ways that we can improve that. And I think, somewhere where we can go is like you say, the recovery side of things, and how, trying to change different bits of nutrition could, improve the actual cardiovascular recovery that we're seeing and lactates that we're monitoring. I think Kat's quite keen on that side of things, and feeding for that type of recovery metric, to see performance improvements there. Could go a long way in actually getting that feedback about each horse and seeing what works from that response from training.
That sounds like something fun to dig into, Kat.
Yeah, we could probably talk after the show, Nerida.
And that's where, I know we've been talking about testing hay more recently, but that's where, paying attention to some of the nutrients in the hay that'll give you, muscle buffering effects. There's so much that we can continue to tweak and fine tune. So quickly, let's just go back to gastric ulcers, because I know we've just talked about lots of things that have improved. I'm going to say with the footy horses, it's absolutely the change in nutrition that has made that change. And I know there's lots of stuff that you do with it, and you still have lots of horses barefoot, I think, during training.
Yeah, it's still something we're doing, yeah.
But when you see as many low fecal pHs as we were initially seeing, you also know that their hindgut is going to have been leaking at that point, and it's just triggering this really low-grade laminitis, essentially, like their feet are sore. So I love that we've nearly eradicated that. That's very cool for me, because again, that was all part of my original research way back. And my PhD supervisor was one of the people who developed Founder Guard, which was used in racehorses a little bit to try and stop that foot soreness as well that was caused by high grain diets. But I'm going to claim that one, if that's okay, you two.
Yeah, absolutely. You've also got his business out of. You've also taken him out of a job.
Yeah, well, he's retired now, luckily, so that's okay. He won't be upset. And I think that product doesn't exist anymore. I'd have to look into that. But anyway, but let's just go back to gastric ulcers, because it's such a hard one because of the lifestyle, I guess, a racehorse leads. There's a lot we can do to manage ulceration when they're in the same stable, but then we've got all these periods of time traveling long distances between stables, and then also race days. It's a tough one, and we're continuing, even with feeding lucerne hay before they work in the morning to fill their stomach up, and even with making sure that they're not going long periods of time without hay, making sure that hay is sort of in their boxes all the time, we're still getting ulceration.
Yeah, I guess we've tried a lot of measures there, and I guess it's all trying to prevent, the outcome of having that gastric ulcer, high grade severe ulcers in the gastric, in the gut there. But we've seen, numerous changes, and we think that, even just as simple as feeding hay before work to provide that buffer does help us overall. But as a whole, we're still seeing quite a large number. And whether or not that's, Kat and I talk about it all the time, is not being able to give omeprazole on race day. There's that withholding period, and that's when obviously the gut is most vulnerable, you'd say.
Yeah, well, you have all these measures in place on a weekly basis, and if you've got a horse that you are currently treating for ulcers and you're giving them Gastrapel daily, and you know what it's doing, it's blocking the acid, and we know that when we do that, the body tries to create more sort of acid producing, I'm not sure what you would call them, cells, and then you come to race day, and it's probably the most stressful time of that horse's week or month, and you take all those sort of preventative measures away, and we're even sort of taking hay away at a point in time, and so they're going to the races on a truck, so they can't graze through that time. We've taken the gastropel away, so then you've suddenly got an influx of acid, and then they're galloping in like their highest intensity effort. And then there's still a period of time after that race where they have to travel back to the stables. And so you sort of can have sort of 10, 12 hours or more, depending on where the races are, where they are completely, sort of out of this bubble that we've been trying to protect them in all this time and do all these things to prevent, and it's just sort of all undone, and that's something that it would be so good if you could get the racing industry to understand that from our point of view, and if there was a way that we could still, provide the horses that sort of shield and help them through it. But so, there's certain things that maybe we could look into, and I think you touched on that earlier about giving them hay on the truck, or or do we give them gastropel when they first get back to the stables, just to sort of help them with that sort of period of stress. But so potentially all this work that we're doing can be undone in one day, and maybe that's potentially where we're getting ulcers straight back, but it's not necessarily the nutrition and everything we're doing prior, but it's just because there's things that are out of our control that if in a perfect world we would be doing differently.
And I guess at the end of the day, it's interesting to see the performance on the track then, and how it correlates with their obviously the ulcers in their gut that they've had from their most recent gastroscope. But we've got enough data now to say, and whether or not you're establishing when are you only taking the horses that have had a gastroscope before their run, which generally, if they're severe ulcers, then they're on some sort of form of medication. So have the ulcers started to clear, and they're not actually through any pain in terms of that grade 3 or 4 ulcer that was in their gut, or are you taking those ones that have been gastroscoped after, or after their run, to say that okay, we can assume that they're possibly their gut was in this state before obviously they're being gastroscoped, and they ran before it and they ran poorly. But looking at all that data and spinning it many different ways, there is very little difference between the performance. But I still firmly believe that a horse, with a healthier gut, and not having to go through that pain, is obviously going to be able to, they say, I think there's some loose research out there to say that, their stride length shortens when horses have been found to have severe ulcers. So I'd like to think that baselining it against themselves with a horse that might always have grade 3s or 4s, if you're getting down that to a grade 2 or a grade 1 ulcer, I do think there will be some sort of incremental increase in performance at the end of the day, where they're able to achieve their ceiling in terms of ability, in terms of on the racetrack and even on the training track too.
That's a really good way to look at it, Josh. Using themselves as the control, which is always difficult when you've only got n=1. But I think, experimentally it used to be, and maybe still now, if you wanted the squamous ulcers, so the ulcers up in the top of the stomach, you just took feed off horses for a period of time and those ulcers would appear. So having up to 12 hours of a day where they're not able to eat normally, or sometimes eat very little at all, is definitely a long enough period of time to start ulceration. But as you were talking, Kat, I had some ideas pinging into my head, so I'll chat with you afterwards. I'm like,
Perfect.
Maybe we can do this and maybe we can do that. But have you got 5 more minutes? Are you still happy to keep going, or do you have to leave?
Absolutely.
No, cool.
Absolutely.
Because one question I really want to ask is, or one thing I really want to talk about is the slump after we changed onto the more digestible grain. And it's something that I see over and over again, and not a lot of trainers have got the perseverance and the courage, I guess, to stick with the change in feed, because a lot of trainers will change feed and then go, that doesn't work, and they'll change back again. But I did warn you about it, and then we did see that slump in performance when we went from a less digestible grain to lower amounts of a more digestible grain. Do you remember, Josh?
Yeah, I guess we made this, with all these things, it's sort of, you do have to make a point in time where you're making that big change, and we wanted to do it across the board. So obviously I think he put forward a suggestion of changing to to a different feed, that more digestible grain, early last year in 2024. We were coming into obviously the big time of year in the autumn. It's another big carnival outside of the spring. All our good horses were up, and I think they were already trialing by then, so we didn't want to mess around with their feed, because obviously there is that lag in the gut, getting the nutritional benefits out of each feed when you're changing it into it, and getting it used to and acclimatized to that new feed. So we didn't want to mess with those horses that were deep into the prep. Most of those had already had runs, so we made a point in time to sort of change the feed at the end of that carnival, which was May last year. And sort of looking at that, we were monitoring, feed refusals, and also the amount of feed that we're actually feeding, which did come down a significant amount. We were basically feeding half a dipper less across the board, which is a huge amount when you think about the size of the stable, which is 40% less in terms of the actual grain that was going into them, which was really good to see. And that was what, you always said, feeding less grain. However, the feed refusals did come up, and then there probably was a slump in performance, but whether or not that was directly tied back to the time of the year. Obviously, all our best horses had just been in work and probably been tipped out to spell. And then I would say, some of the results that we've had in the 2024 spring were the best that Ciaron's ever had in his whole career. So, the slump was sort of worth it in a way. Whether or not the slump was directly correlated with that new, more digestible grain, and it was the horses possibly just getting used to it, obviously leaving potentially a bit of feed, and whether or not feed left actually is a direct correlation with a slump in performance, because I've tried to analyze that myself and always wanted to talk to you about it. Nerida is looking at feed refusals, and should you be trying to feed them a more concentrated hit of nutrition, when you see horses that are racing possibly tomorrow, and they leave their feed leading into that, are they getting the right fuel for their race tomorrow? And anecdotally, just looking at a few horses in the last couple of weeks, I've noticed a lot of horses that have left feed and actually gone on to perform really well on the racetrack. So, it's whether or not that slump in performance was directly with them sort of working up the appetite for the new feed. It's hard to say, but then the performance on the racetrack in the spring was, it was well worth it in terms of that improvement across the whole spring, in terms of not only just the high level elite horses, but also those lower ones who might actually need they need the more optimal nutrition and training plans more so than those top horses, because it's the old nature versus nurture sort of debate there.
So again, there's ways that we can explain the increase in feed refusals would be partly, at least. I mean, it's a completely different feed, so they're going, well, what is this you're trying to poison us with today? They're naturally suspicious of new things, and also too the extruded feeds, because of the shape of them. They've got a funny mouthfeel, and I've seen it consistently throughout my career. You go and put an extruded feed in front of a horse that's never seen one before, and they will be a little bit funny about it until they realise what it is. But the slump, and I've seen it many times, which is why I was able to say to you, be prepared that we may see a bit of a slump in performance here. But I'm pretty sure what happens, and none of this is measured, this is just me, observing stables going through this. But when you've got horses that have been on high grain, less digestible diets, their hindgut is set up to have more starch fermenting microbes, less fiber fermenting microbes. So all of a sudden, when you take a lot of that starch away from those microbes, and you're expecting the hindgut to flip back around and go back to a fiber fermenting system, there's the rechargeable battery is no longer fully charged. It's maybe half to 3/4, like you're getting less energy getting pumped out of that hindgut. And then when after 2 to 3 weeks, when we sort of see the slump starting to disappear, it's when your fiber fermenting bacteria, the populations pick back up again, and are able to really extract that energy out of the fibers for the horse again, and then your rechargeable batteries back to fully charged. So I think that's really the only way I can explain it from a physiology perspective, why we sort of tend to see this drop off. But I'm so glad that you stuck it out, because it is really easy in that point in time just to go, nope, not working, and pull the pin. But stuck it out and saw that they came back.
And just to sort of touch on that as well, I've sort of continued to remind the trainers of that, the understanding of that change. And when we have horses that have come from different stables where we would assume that they've been on that high grain diet and they transition to our stable and straight away they're, given a completely different fiber-based diet, to expect that sort of lag in how they look or their performance. And, we've seen it recently. We've had quite a few horses join the stable and it's been good to be able to sort of explain that sort of like how they look, and the trainers are actually, understand and, can sort of work around that as well. And they've got an understanding of why. And then also just some horses that have been pre-training, and I actually worked with you, Nerida, to help change a couple of those diets from one location where we have a lot of horses sort of do their spelling, and notice that those horses were the ones that were sort of struggling when they first came into the stable, and sort of how we could manage that. So you definitely see it, and it's not something that was just in that period where we changed, but we're also sort of seeing it, with those horses that are coming from sort of a different sort of pathway into the stable, but just managing it. And I suppose it's just understanding the why, but we're still seeing it, but getting through it.
I also think that's a really good point there, Kat, is horses coming from different stables. But I think when we were testing a lot of the pHs as well, what was interesting was seeing a lot of the internationals that we had low pHs. And I think, Nerida, you had some thoughts there. And I actually think, I don't completely put this down to nutrition, but a big part of these horses that we constantly see the internationals that come out and take a 1 or 2 to acclimatize to Australian racing conditions, and it could be a lot of that could be down to nutrition at the end of the day, because they could be completely different feeds over in sort of Europe, would you say?
Well, and they've come through quarantine too, obviously. So most of what you're seeing in those horses' guts is what they would have been fed during quarantine. Because the Europeans tend to be pretty good with the way they feed their racehorses. I remember a very funny conversation I had with a French trainer. It was like 2016, and I was trying to, his English was good, but I was trying to ask him how often he puts his horses out for a spell, which, if you ask any Australian trainer that, and they would be able to answer that question because I know what I'm talking about. So our terminology was a little bit mixed up, but most of the reason he was confused was that he would have horses in the stable in training for 4 years at a time.
Crazy.
I know. And in Japan that's normal too. Like the horses come in as long yearlings and are broken in, and a lot of those horses will not leave a stable until they've finished racing at the end of their careers. So, we have to be so focused on their gut health over there, because if we're not, they wouldn't cope with that.
Yeah.
So it's I think what you're probably seeing is maybe it is that we need to go back to the quarantine and see what they're doing in there. But anyway, we need to wrap this up. So to finish, normally on our podcasts we do a clear round of quick questions with no refusals, but I think for you we need to change it to our final straight. make it a little bit more racing relevant. But so question for both of you: what is your all-time favorite horse, movie, or book?
I'd say Seabiscuit. Resilience, underdog.
Yep. Yeah. Funnily enough, Kat, we were just talking about Seabiscuit this morning because my daughter had to have surgery a couple of weeks ago, and she has a giant hole right at the top, or sort of at the base of her tailbone. And the nurses that keep doing her dressing say, "Please don't ride a horse. Please don't ride a horse." And she's got the first competition with this off the track that she's got coming up in a week's time, and she just keeps saying to me, "I'm riding." And I was just telling her about the jockey in Seabiscuit this morning, when the trainer says, "I'd rather break," was it his leg that he had busted? "I'd rather break that than break his heart." Yeah. So it's a cool movie. What about you, Josh?
Probably a different angle for me. A book called Gambling for Life by Harry Finley. It's his biography. He's a a big punter in the UK, and he owned a great horse called Demon, who was a great jumper over in the UK, champion. And he's got a couple of funny stories in there about when he came to Australia to watch sort of the Australian Open and was betting on it, and as well as he caught a helicopter out to Sale to see a dog run, and he says the locals thought it was a UFO coming down from the sky, and they'd never seen anything like that in their life. It's quite funny.
How long ago was that? Must be.
Yeah, it must have been 25 years ago. So.
Yeah, well, that's funny. Well, one myth about nutrition for racing thoroughbreds you wish would disappear forever.
That racehorses need lots of grain for energy.
Agree.
You beat me to it.
Excellent.
We're aligned.
Oh, I love it. I love hearing that. Because that's. I think if everyone understood that, if all trainers understood that, then so many racehorses would be so much better off, and then performance would be so much better as well. If the Ciaron Maher Racing horses could talk, what would they say about life in this stable versus one of the more traditional stables in the country?
Well, I'd like to think that they would say they'd feel good and they're eating well and they're happy, and probably just don't change the breakfast menu.
Yeah, I would think that they're asking what St. George is having, because it looks pretty good. and he seems like he's always positive and upbeat these days.
Actually, has his personality, as an aside, has his personality changed? Like, does anyone know him well enough from before to know whether he's a bit different, or I mean, he's not in pain, so.
Yeah, I think I had sort of asked yesterday, and they sort of said, oh, he's a lot more up and about in the types, and they're like, he wouldn't be doing this, and he was pawing the ground, so he was wanting to get pats, and he just looks bright.
Yeah, good. Such a cool story. If you could ride any horse, past or present, which horse would it be? It doesn't need to be a real one either. We've had some of the My Little Ponies in this answer, and Pegasus.
No, mine would definitely be Lonhro. He was always my favourite racehorse growing up, and he just always had that presence about him. You just feel like you just will to win. I'd love to have been able to ride Lonhro.
I think it'd be Chautauqua for me. Just he's just that
just fit
thrill.
The gates, or
not later in life. I was going to mention that, but yeah.
I worked with him a little bit when he was like after racing, trying to get him.
Oh yeah,
he was an interesting horse. I would have loved to have had a look inside his gut to see what was going on in there. But smart horse, I think, and just went nah.
Yeah. It'd be great to have data on him to see if there's any differences, or if it was all just mental, which I think it's the latter.
Oh, wouldn't it? If you had 2 minutes with every thoroughbred trainer in the world, what would you ask them, or what would you tell them?
I'd probably just tell them to keep questioning the norm, and the biggest breakthroughs really come from curiosity and asking why, and not being afraid to try something new, I think. And every horse teaches us something, so as long as you're willing to listen, which most horse trainers do on a daily basis without realizing it, but just continue questioning the why of what they're doing.
Yeah, I'd definitely be asking where they think they could innovate next, because I think everyone would come up with a very different answer. Some would come up with no answer, but I think those up the top and talking to the likes of an Aidan O'Brien would be fascinating to see where he could go next.
Yeah,
because he's at the top of the game, but when you're at the top, you're always trying to push the boundaries even further.
Excellent. And just to finish off, where to next for Ciaron Maher Racing from my perspective, from a nutrition perspective? What have you got your sights set on?
Well, I think you've got a couple of things you want to talk to me about after this, but I think just refining feed around, more specifically around different horses based on, age. So those early sort of 2-year-olds, and maybe sort of the distance and the workload, and actually trying to fuel the horse for what they're trying to do on a daily basis, rather than sort of, they sort of get that same feed daily, or whether they're 2 or whether they're 5. So making that a bit more specific, I think, would be one step.
Yeah, I think just refining around that that distance profiling and feeding differently for obviously your sprinters and your stayers a lot more, and the refinement over that, and being able to measure that as well a little bit more accurately. We're trying to delve into the world of recovery, which is everything in human performance at the moment, and how does it affect sleep, or does it affect markers like HRV and resting heart rate that tend to be correlated with how a readiness score, which has been widely done work in the human wearable space, and how does nutrition relate in with that? So tying those two data sets together, which will be really fascinating to start to answer and see correlations and validate some of the nutrition plans.
Yeah, it's there's so much to do, isn't there? So many different directions we could go in. But thank you. Thank you both so much. I'm really, really grateful to you both, and also to the Ciaron Maher Racing stable for being willing to talk about this and to share, what you've done and what you've learned, because it really will. My hope is that it will help the industry as a whole and the horses in the industry. And it's just, I love talking to you because it's so fascinating watching you on such a big scale. We make these changes, and then these are the outcomes we see, or the outcomes that we don't see, and we need to go back to plan B. But thank you for sharing what you know, and for chatting today.
Thanks, Nerida. And I was also just going to, say that it really is continuing to educate the industry, and if we can continue to make those changes, and it's better for the whole population of horses, and that's really why we're doing what we're doing, and continue to move forward.
Yeah, and thank you very much for being a part of that.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Love it, love it, love it. I want to thank Kat and Josh for their time and for their willingness to share what they are doing with the broader racing community. That takes smart thinking and generosity, and it's exactly what our industry needs. The work happening at Ciaron Maher Racing proves that when we feed horses in a way that honours their biology, we don't have to choose between welfare and performance. They go hand in hand. Better health means better horses, full stop. If you're a trainer, an owner, or anyone involved in racing, I hope this episode has given you some food for thought. Question the status quo, ask why more often, and remember that every horse has something to teach us if we're willing to listen. Oh, and as a cool little follow-on from the story of St. George, he raced just after this podcast was recorded and flew home for a second place, apparently surprising everyone, including his jockey. If you'd like to know more about the My Happy Horse virtual nutritionist, or would just like more resources about equine nutrition, head on over to our website, myhappy.horse. And if you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and share it with someone who might benefit from hearing this conversation. Until next time, keep your horses happy, healthy, and running fast.